April 1943. Northern England lay under a sheet of grey, the kind that muted sound and colour alike. The war had painted everything in shades of exhaustion. At Rath Linton-on-Ouse, dawn was still a rumour on the horizon, and the airfield breathed with the metallic scent of oil, frost, and rain. The hangar lights buzzed weakly against the dark, halos of yellow bleeding through cigarette smoke. Mechanics moved like ghosts between bombers, great hulking beasts of riveted steel and wounded pride. Each aircraft bore the scars of too many nights spent between life and ruin. Inside, a man crouched beneath one of them, a Lancaster bomber meant to lead a raid at first light. His hands, wrapped in grime and collis, moved with the slow precision of someone who knew what failure cost. The others called him Mac. Nobody remembered his first name anymore. He wasn't a pilot or an officer, just a mechanic who rarely spoke above a whisper. He had been at it since midnight. 4 hours of silence, broken only by the drip of water from the rafters and the occasional curse from the flight crew. Somewhere deep inside the fuselage, a circuit had burned itself into oblivion. The bomber's control panel, its nerve center, was dead. Bloody things finished. Someone muttered near the wing. No replacements. No spares. Might as well send her to the scrapyard. Mac didn't answer. He only ran a thumb along the charred wire, feeling the texture of defeat. He'd seen it before. In the engines that refused to start, in men too tired to keep fighting. But this was different. This was the heart of the aircraft gone silent. Above him, the squadron leader's voice cut through the hangar. That plane flies at dawn, or none of you do. We've got 2 hours. Make it work. The men exchanged looks, half disbelief, half fear. Orders didn't fix machines. Orders only made the air colder. Mac stood stretching the ache from his back, his breath fogged in the dim light. Around him, the crew scattered to their stations, trying and failing to find a miracle in empty supply crates. A radio hissed in the corner, the BBC mumbling news of distant battles. North Africa, Italy, somewhere warmer than here. He focused on the bomber. She was called Eleanor. Her nose bore a hand-painted angel with chipped wings. She'd flown 9 missions and limped home from 6. Now she lay silent, her wings heavy with frost, her belly still full of bombs that would never see the sky. Mac leaned close to the open panel. He smelled burnt copper and insulation. The fuse box was half melted, the wires fused into a knot of useless metal. He pulled off his gloves and pressed his fingertips against the steel. Cold, dead, the others had already given up. "It's over, Mac," one of them said, wiping his hands on a rag. "Command'll reassign the mission. You can't build a new circuit from scraps." But Mac wasn't listening. His eyes had narrowed, focused on a single detail. A faint line of soot tracing down one of the panels. Something about it spoke to him, though he couldn't yet explain why. Outside, the wind howled against the hangar doors, shaking the walls. Somewhere above, the night began to pale toward dawn. He stood motionless for a long time, the storm tapping a rhythm against the roof. It was then that something shifted, not in the bomber but in him. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched the shadow of his own hand over the ruined circuit and whispered, almost to himself, "It's not dead. Not yet." The others didn't hear him. They'd already turned away. But Mac stayed there, staring at the broken heart of the machine as the lights flickered once more, and the hum of failing electricity danced faintly through the hangar air, like a ghost refusing to die. He didn't know it yet, but the spark he sought was already waiting for him, hidden in plain sight. April 1943, 03:18 a.m. The rain eased to a mist that beaded on metal and skin alike. The hangar took a long, tired breath. Somewhere outside, a generator coughed back to life and the light steadied, washing the bomber's flank in a dull amber glow. Mac slid a wooden crate beneath the open panel and sat without ceremony. He laid out what little he had: a cracked voltmeter, a handful of frayed leads, a stub of graphite pencil, and a mess tin with the lid bent into a rough plate. His hands were steady now, as if the night's decision had already been made inside him. Footsteps approached, measured, impatient. The squadron leader, coat collar up, cap pulled low, stopped at the wing root. "Status." "Main control circuit burned through," Mac said without looking up. Heat traveled along a path that shouldn't exist. There's a bypass somewhere it shouldn't be. English. She's dead. A rigger called from the tail, eager to be done with it. We're out of spares. Mac spoke as if to the wires. Dead is a word we use when we've run out of imagination. The leader's gaze cooled. Imagination doesn't fly sorties. You have 90 minutes. He left the words hanging like frost and moved on. Mac listened to the retreating steps, then returned to the panel. He traced the suit trail again, slow as reading a name on a grave. The mark ran along a bulkhead seam, a hair, thin line of black slipping behind a bracket where no cable should run. He loosened the bracket screws with the tip of his knife. The metal squealed, then gave. Behind it, a thin insulating sleeve sagged open, sliced by a burr on the edge. A wire, no thicker than a reed, had chafed through and kissed the frame. One touch in the wrong moment, and the current had raced home the quick way, devouring the fuse box before anyone could blink. He exhaled through his nose, not triumph but recognition. He had met this kind of failure before, in tractors in winter, in radios that screamed and went dark. Not malice, not bad luck, just a small cruelty of friction that no one noticed until it ruined everything. He rested his thumb against the wounded sleeve and looked up at the cockpit's dark windows. "You poor girl," he said, too quiet for anyone to hear. "You tried to tell us." The pilot of Eleanor appeared at the ladder, flight jacket half, zipped helmet slung by its strap. Young, with tired eyes that had seen more fire than birthdays. He hovered, unsure whether to speak. "Mac," he said at last, voice careful. "If she doesn't fly, command grounds the lot. We're the eyes, without us, they're blind over the coast." Mac nodded. "I know. I've 12 men betting their lives on your hands." The pilot swallowed. "That includes mine." Mac studied the frayed edge of the sleeve. "Then we won't let them down." The pilot hesitated, then offered a small, lopsided smile. "They say you once started a Merlin with a tea candle." "I started a cold man with a cup of tea," Mac said. The engine came second. The smile reached the pilot's eyes for just a heartbeat. He climbed into the cockpit, leaving Mac with the problem and the clock. 04:02 a.m. The mist thinned. Rainwater crawled off the wing in slow beads, dripping to the hangar floor with soft, deliberate ticks. Somewhere a kettle screamed and then was silenced. The men spoke less now. Night does that, it takes the talk out of people and leaves only the truth. Mac measured voltage at the remaining points, calling numbers to himself like a litany. He pried the fuse box open. It crumbled, a sugared mass of blackened phenolic and regret. He tested the bus bars, found them scorched but salvageable if he could keep heat away from the weak points. He needed a stable bridge, a form to carry bite and burn without surrender. He searched the tool chest. Too thick, too brittle, too conductive in the wrong way, too few. He flattened the mess, tin lid, and tried to imagine it in place. It buckled. He needed something with spring and memory. Something that would hold against vibration and heat without cracking. Something that could be shaped by hand yet resist failing where the current bit hardest. He tapped his pockets, habit, not hope. Cigarette case, matchbook. A spoon from the canteen he'd forgotten to return. Steel, thin at the neck, broader at the bowl. He held it by the handle and pressed the bowl against the curve of the panel. It flexed, then sprung back with a soft, eager resilience. The edge caught the light. A pale crescent in the amber glow. He didn't smile. He simply set the spoon beside the voltmeter and kept working, letting the idea sit like a coal in ash, quiet, gathering heat. At 04:19, a corporal arrived with a clipboard and bad news. No spares at Topcliffe. Transport grounded at Dishforth. Weather's knackered. "Sir says pull what you can from a trainer." "We pull from a trainer," Mac said. "We ground a kid who needs to survive his first landing." "No. Orders, Mac." "Tell him I'll give him something better than orders." The corporal stared a moment, then left with a muttered oath that sounded more like faith than frustration. Mac cleaned the contact points with the last of the solvent, hands moving with deliberate economy. He wrapped the wounded wire in new sleeve, cut from a length meant for a radio set, and secured it away from the hungry edge that had chewed it. He rotated a pair of leads to reduce load near the weakest section of bus. He was not building a cathedral. He was laying duckboards in a swamp one sure plank at a time. So men could cross. He took the spoon and pressed it against the melted face of the fuse box, turning it in small degrees, testing the fit. He marked 2 points with the graphite pencil, dark smudges on bright metal. He clamped the handle under the crate's lip and bent the bowl with a slow, careful pressure until it matched the curve he needed, a thin spring capable of hugging the contact plate and distributing heat away from the scarred center. It would not be a fuse. It would be a brace, a cooling tongue, a way to turn a point of failure into a wider shore where current could land without burning through. Footsteps returned, the squadron leader again, colder now. We're inside 1 hour. Mac didn't look up. Then listen. If we try to replace what's gone, we fail. If we insist on what's proper, we fail. If we accept that she'll never be pretty again, she might just live. You're proposing a bodge. I'm proposing mercy for a machine asked to do too much. He lifted the spoon, the improvised curve catching the light. This spreads the load, buys us the start, buys us the climb. After that, she's on physics and faith. The leader's jaw worked. He stared at the small, ordinary thing in Mac's hand, a utensil meant for soup and quiet meals in peacetime. If it goes wrong, then it goes wrong up here. Mac tapped the panel. Not in a wing tank or a prop. Better a dark cockpit than a funeral pyre. Silence. The leader's eyes shifted to the pilot's shadow in the cockpit. Back to Mac. 5 minutes, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. Then we test. Mac nodded and returned to the task. He filed an edge of the spoon to a smoother arc, wiped the filings into his palm, and let them fall like grey glitter to the floor. He bored 2 small holes with a self, tapping screw and patience, anchoring the brace to a bracket that still had bite. He layered a strip of insulating card between the spoon and the remains of the box, then cinched a wire across the improvised tongue to keep it pressed where it needed to live. Nothing rattled. Nothing sang. He listened anyway, because machines speak before they scream 04 and 47. The hangar door yawned, letting in a slab of paling sky. The airfield beyond stirred, a truck grinding into gear, ground crew moving like ants around other bombers that were somehow ready when Eleanor was not. Men glanced in and away, superstitious about watching another man's fight with fate. Mac rechecked every connection by touch, the way blind men rid. He closed the panel halfway and left it open enough to see what the first surge would try to kill. He lifted his hand to the pilot in the cockpit. "Power on," he said. Slow. A click. A pause. Another click. Somewhere in the bomber's ribs, relays woke like creatures in hibernation deciding whether to trust the light. A needle twitched. A gauge lifted its eyelid. The fuse box did not hiss. The spoon did not glow. Mac watched unmoving as current crept along the path he had drawn for it. Cautious, then bolder. "Hold it there," he said. He leaned in and sniffed for the smell every mechanic learns to fear, the sweet, cloying breath of plastic dying. Nothing. Just oil and rain and the faint tang of hot dust. "Bring her up," he said. The pilot advanced the control, and the panel came alive in increments, lamps winking awake. Needles rising like birds stunned and recovering, a soft, fragile chorus of systems remembering their parts. Somewhere aft, a man laughed once and then smothered the sound as if it were blasphemy. Mac laid his palm against the panel, feeling for the tremor of heat. The brace was warm, not burning. The warmth was spreading the way he'd hoped, dissipating into metal that could drink it. The squadron leader leaned in. "Will it hold?" Mac didn't answer with words. He nodded to the pilot. "Engine 1, the pilot called. The starter whined. The prop blurred. A cough, a rumble, a stumble, then a clean, rolling thunder that filled the hangar and made the skin on Mac's forearms rise. The spoon did not flicker. The lights did not die. Engine 2. Another growl joined the first, their voices knitting into something that sounded like survival. Men who had been pretending indifference now watched openly, faces lit by instrument glow and the first suggestion of a sky that wanted to be morning. "Throttle to idle," Mac said. "Hold her there." He checked again, warm, not cruel. The current was behaving as if it had been given a second chance and dared not waste it. He closed the panel and fastened it with a final, decisive twist of the wrist. The leader's voice came from the doorway, softer. If this works, you've just pulled a squadron from the edge. Mac wiped his hands on a rag that had lost the battle long ago. If it works, they'll see dawn from above the weather instead of beneath it. The leader looked at the rag, at Mac's hands, at the spoon that no longer looked like a spoon at all. What do I put in the log? Mac shrugged. Electrical brace. Local manufacture. The leader almost smiled. By whom? Be the war, Mac said, and turned away. Au fi toivem, the grey outside pushed toward blue. Ground crew rolled Eleanor out into the cold. The engines idled with a steady patience that made men want to believe. The crew clambered aboard, patting the fuselage as if it could feel their gratitude. The pilot paused at the hatch and looked down at Mac. If we make it back, he said, I'll bring your spoon. Bring the men, Mac said. The spoon can find its own way. The pilot's mouth tightened into something like a promise. He disappeared inside. Mac stepped back, out of the wash of the props. He watched the bomber tremble, then settle into her own skin. He thought of the chafed wire and the burr, of how small things kill and small things save. He thought of the countless hands that had touched this machine, riveters, welders, painters, dreamers, and how none of them would ever know about the thin curve of steel hidden behind her heartbeat. He stood very still. The world narrowed to the line between failure and flight. In the next hour, pressure would move through the ranks like weather, and choices would harden into orders. But for a few breaths, there was only this: the quiet certainty that the impossible problem had met a man who refused to define it that way. He turned toward his bench and picked up the graphite pencil. On the back of a grease-stained maintenance card, he drew a small arc and 2 dots, and beneath them he wrote, simply brace. He slipped the card into his pocket, as if the idea needed warmth. Outside, Eleanor rolled forward, slow and sure, like a wounded animal that had decided to live. He didn't know it yet, but the shape he had bent in the cold would not only lift one aircraft out of darkness, it would push an entire squadron through the narrow gap between disaster and dawn. And as the engines gathered their courage, somewhere beyond the horizon, the pressure began to build. 05:43 a.m. The first light of dawn crept over the airfield, pale and reluctant. It painted the hangars in thin gold and silver, making every dent, every scar on the bombers seem deeper than before. The rain had stopped, but the world was still soaked, puddles trembling with the low thrum of engines warming across the field. Mac stood just outside the hangar door, coat collar high, watching the morning stretch awake. Eleanor sat in the center of it all, alive, humming softly like a living creature rediscovering its breath. But peace never lingered long in wartime. Behind him, the footsteps of officers and mechanics drummed a different rhythm, one of urgency, of fear kept just barely in check. Word had spread through the base like smoke. The squadron was grounded unless Eleanor flew. 200 men waited for her signal to rise, and every second she didn't move was another second closer to catastrophe. Command wants confirmation, a voice barked from the corridor. It was Lieutenant Harris, his uniform immaculate despite the sleepless night. He carried the clipped authority of a man who measured time in missions, not minutes. Can she hold a full load? Mac didn't look at him. She'll hold if she's treated kindly. Harris exhaled through his nose. Machines don't need kindness, they need results. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You've put a spoon in her guts, Mac, a spoon. If that brace fails mid-flight, she won't fail. Harris studied him for a long moment. You'd better be right. The Germans won't wait for your engineering experiments. The officer turned away, his boots echoing against concrete. Mac's jaw tightened. He'd heard it all before, the disbelief, the quiet contempt. But he'd also seen what desperation could build when rules no longer fit the need. Inside the hangar, the crew gathered their gear. Flight jackets creaked, oxygen masks dangled at their sides. Someone whistled a tune under his breath, an old pub song turned hollow by fatigue. The smell of coffee, engine fuel, and wet wool hung heavy in the air. Sergeant Mills, the flight engineer, crouched beside Mac as he double-checked the voltage. You really trust that thing to fly? He asked quietly. Mac didn't look up. I trust what I can touch. You don't trust men. Mac paused, then wiped a smear of grease on his sleeve. Men break quicker than wire. The sergeant gave a dry laugh that died as soon as it was born. Fair enough. They worked in silence after that. The hum of the hangar filled every thought. Fans spinning, relays clicking, tools clanging on the floor. Every sound felt amplified by nerves. Outside, the field commander's jeep pulled up, spraying mud. A cluster of officers emerged, their breath white in the cold air. Their eyes moved over the bombers like chess pieces, calculating what could be sacrificed and what could not. Mac saw them but didn't speak. He knew what they saw in him. A grease-stained mechanic too stubborn to accept defeat, standing between command and a mission that could change the balance over the channel. He rechecked the panel. The spoon brace still gleamed faintly beneath the soft glow of the instruments. Heat had spread evenly overnight, no stress marks, no warping. It had survived the night's test. But dawn brought a new challenge, full operational load, live systems, and flight vibration. He could already feel the pressure tightening around him. Every tick of the clock carried a different kind of sound now. Not mechanical, human. The sound of command losing patience. 30 minutes to take off. Someone shouted across the hangar. The words echoed, bouncing between metal walls like a warning bell. Crewmen moved faster, loading maps. Checking harnesses, counting parachutes. A mechanic slipped on a puddle and cursed the sky. A radio cracked with static, announcing shifting winds and low visibility over the North Sea. Mac felt the storm coming, not outside, but within the chain of command. One wrong spark, one missed beat, and everything he'd built in the dark hours would be torn apart by protocol. He wiped his hands again, slower this time. He wasn't worried about the machine. He was worried about the people who didn't understand her heartbeat. A young private jogged in with a telegram in his fist. "Orders from High Command!" he called out. The hangar fell into a hush as the captain tore the seal. His brow furrowed. Mission advanced. Luftwaffe formations spotted moving west. Takeoff in 20. A murmur rippled through the crew, half disbelief, half resignation. The captain looked toward Eleanor, then toward Mac. "You heard the man," he said. His voice steady but strained. "If that bird isn't airborne by sunrise, we'll be fighting blind." Mac didn't reply. He bent closer to the panel, fingers tracing the spoon's edge, checking every screw by feel. The metal was cool under his touch, but alive, vibrating faintly with energy waiting to be unleashed. Outside, the wind shifted east. The first hints of dawn touched the clouds, and in that uncertain half-light, Mac's reflection appeared on the aluminum surface, blurred, tired, but unyielding. He whispered to no one, "She'll fly." No one answered. Only the wind did, low, steady, carrying with it the promise of storm and sky. And as the engines began to cough awake, the true weight of the morning settled on him. The mission had begun, and with it, the test of whether a man's faith in his own hands could stand against the full machinery of war. The airfield pulsed with a rhythm only war could compose, engines snarling. Boots pounding, orders shouted through the morning fog. The first rays of sunlight bled across the horizon, gilding the bomber wings in pale gold. But beauty had no place here. Every man moved with a singular purpose: make the impossible flight happen or face the consequences. Mac stood beneath Eleanor's wing, hands black with oil, eyes fixed on the heart of the machine. The spoon brace gleamed faintly inside the panel, a small, stubborn fragment of hope against an ocean of doubt. Behind him, the squadron leader's voice cut through the hangar. "Warm her up. I want every system checked in sequence. We go in 15. "Yes, sir," came the reply. But the words carried hesitation. Everyone knew the risk. If Mac's repair failed midair, there would be no way back, not for the crew, not for the mission. The engines of the other bombers were already rumbling, one after another, until the entire airfield trembled. Exhaust plumes rose like ghostly banners into the morning haze. Ground crews darted between aircraft, eyes wide with tension, each man aware that one broken system could doom them all. Mac climbed the ladder to Eleanor's cockpit, the cold metal rungs biting through his gloves. Inside, the crew was strapping in, faces set in that quiet, practiced calm soldiers wear before every uncertain dawn. The pilot turned as Mac entered. "You're cutting it close. She's ready?" Mac said. His voice was low but firm. The pilot studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We trust you." Mac knelt by the control panel and pressed a palm against it. Warm, alive. The faint vibration of current hummed through the metal like a heartbeat. He adjusted the voltage regulator, ensuring the load stayed balanced. Any surge now would be catastrophic. Outside, rain began again, light, almost reluctant. The hangar doors rolled open, groaning against their rails. Cold air swept in, carrying the scent of fuel and earth. Dawn was no longer distant. It was here, pale and merciless. The squadron leader appeared at the base of the ladder. "Mac, commands on the line. They want confirmation." "Can she fly?" Mac's jaw clenched. "She'll fly." "You'd better be right," the leader said. "Because if she doesn't, the rest don't leave the ground." He disappeared into the roar outside, his words lingering like smoke. Mac glanced at the pilot. "Start her." The pilot flicked the ignition switches in sequence. Engine 1, choke sputter, then a deep rising growl. Engine 2, catching immediately, the prop spinning faster, smoother. The air vibrated, the gauges twitched. Every light on the panel came alive in a slow, golden glow. Mac held his breath. The spoon brace sat quietly in its place, absorbing the heat, spreading the load like he'd intended. No flicker, no hiss. The pilot leaned toward him. "She's holding steady." Mac nodded once. "Keep her there." He stepped back, watching as the crew ran through final checks. The navigator unfolded a map. The gunner loaded belts into his turret. The aircraft felt alive again, awake, ready, proud. And yet, beneath the mechanical thunder, Mac could hear the human side of it, the muttered prayers, the quiet glances, the shared understanding that this might be the last sunrise any of them would see. He climbed down from the cockpit and stepped into the wet gravel. The ground crews were clearing the runway, their silhouettes dark against the lightening sky. He looked toward the operations hut. Inside, officers stood around a table covered in maps, moving pins, arguing in clipped tones. He didn't need to hear the words. He already knew what was at stake. A runner sprinted across the field, his voice breaking through the roar. 15 minutes to enemy movement! Scramble all squadrons! The order hit like a gunshot! Every mechanic, every pilot, every officer moved at once. The ground became a frenzy of motion, fuel trucks pulling away, bomb racks sealing. Signal flares firing red into the sky. Mac turned back to Eleanor. She stood poised at the runway's edge, engines rumbling like restrained thunder. The pilot gave a thumbs up through the glass. He returned it silently. The squadron leader appeared beside him. "You did your part, Mac. Now pray she does hers." Mac didn't look away from the bomber. "Machines don't pray," he said softly. "They listen." The leader frowned. "To what?" "To the hands that built them." The whistle blew. The first bomber began its roll, engines screaming, tires spitting water. One after another, the others followed, massive shapes lifting from the wet earth, their bellies heavy with fate. Then came Eleanor. She roared forward, the ground shaking under Mac's boots. He watched the landing lights cut through mist, bright and defiant. The engines surged, the wings lifted. For a moment she hovered between gravity and grace. Then she rose, slow but steady, into the low clouds, leaving the ground behind as if the world below had never existed. The squadron leader exhaled beside him. "She's flying." Mac didn't smile. His hands were still, his eyes locked on the shrinking shape in the sky. "She's living," he murmured. The hangar around them seemed to exhale. Men who'd been holding their breath for hours finally let it go. Some laughed quietly, some just stood in silence, staring upward. But Mac stayed still, the rain dripping from his cap, his gaze following the silver glint until it disappeared into the clouds. He knew what came next. The pressure would only grow. Command would demand more, the machines would be pushed harder, and somewhere another problem would arise, another impossible fix waiting for hands like his. He turned back toward the hangar, the distant thunder of engines still echoing in his chest. The puddles reflected the faint orange of sunrise, but the light felt thin, fragile, temporary. War didn't reward miracles, it expected them, and as he walked back into the dim, oil-streaked shadows of the hangar, Mac knew the hardest part had only just begun. The sky had taken his creation, and soon it would test the man who made it. Night again. The war had a way of folding days into each other until time stopped meaning anything. It was always cold, always damp, always waiting for something to break. 3 days had passed since Eleanor's flight, and the airfield wore its exhaustion like an old wound. The bombers that returned were riddled with holes, paint scorched, landing gear trembling with every touchdown. But they had made it back, every single one. Mac watched them from the edge of the tarmac, a cigarette burning low between his fingers. The faces that climbed down from the planes told him more than reports ever could. Relief, disbelief, grief, all in the same stare. The mission had succeeded, but the price was written in the eyes of men who had seen too much sky on fire. He dropped the cigarette into a puddle and turned toward the hangar. Inside, the silence felt heavier than the noise outside. Tools were scattered across benches, half-cleaned components left in neat chaos. A smell of ozone and oil lingered like memory. He walked past the rows of engines, their steel skin still warm from flight. At the far end of the hangar, Eleanor rested again, her flanks dark with soot, her left wing patched with a hastily welded plate. She looked tired but unbroken, alive in a way that only machines born for survival could be. Mac climbed the ladder to her cockpit, each step echoing softly. He reached for the panel he'd rewired, fingertips brushing the bolts and rivets that held his makeshift brace in place. Still solid. The spoon hadn't bent, hadn't burned. It had endured the strain of combat flight. For a man like him, that was enough proof of worth. Yet something inside him stayed uneasy. He sat on the pilot's seat, resting his elbows on his knees, eyes tracing the faint glow of the gauges. The hangar light flickered behind him, and for a moment, he could almost see his own reflection ghosted across the canopy glass. Tired eyes, oil-stained skin, and the kind of quiet that only existed in men who fixed death for a living. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere far off. Distant artillery or just another storm, he couldn't tell. He leaned back, closing his eyes. The hum of machines filled the silence, steady, rhythmic. He could almost hear them breathe. The door creaked open behind him. Sergeant Mill's voice drifted in, soft but cautious. "You still at it?" Mac didn't turn. "If I leave her alone too long, she might get ideas." Mills chuckled weakly. "Command's asking for you. They want to know how the hell you pulled it off." "They wouldn't understand," Mac said. "They don't know what a broken wire feels like." Mills stepped closer, wiping his hands on his coveralls. "You're not sleeping. You've been here every night since the mission. Machines don't sleep." Mac murmured. "You're not a machine." Mac didn't answer. He stared at the panel, his gaze fixed on the faint discoloration where the circuit had burned through days ago. That thin, black scar haunted him. It wasn't just a reminder of failure. It was a whisper of how close they'd come to losing everything. He pulled out the old maintenance card from his pocket, the one with the graphite sketch of the spoon brace. The edges were soft now, corners smudged by grease. He ran a thumb over the lines, remembering how desperation had turned into design. "What are you looking at?" Mills asked. "An accident that worked," Mac said quietly. "But I want to know why it worked." Mills frowned. "Why does it matter? It held. That's what counts." Mac shook his head slowly. "Luck doesn't hold forever. There's a reason behind everything. Every spark, every shock, every sound a machine makes before it dies. You just have to listen long enough." He set the card down on the control column and opened the panel again. The faint smell of metal and burnt resin rose into the air. He touched the spoon brace gently, almost reverently. The edges were clean, unscarred. But where the current had traveled, there was a pattern, tiny concentric marks etched into the metal's surface, like ripples frozen in time. Mac leaned closer, frowning. He'd seen those marks before in turbine bearings, in magnetos after long flights. They weren't random. They were rhythm. He felt it then, not a thought, not a realization, but a pulse of something deeper. A pattern connecting everything he'd ever repaired, every wire and valve that had ever failed in his hands. Machines, he thought, were not dead things. They remembered. They carried the ghost of every current that had passed through them, every vibration, every imperfection. If you could read that memory, you could predict the next failure, maybe even prevent it. He sat back, the idea settling in his mind like a spark waiting for fuel. Mills broke the silence. "You've got that look again." "What look?" "The one you had before you fixed her with a bloody spoon." Mac smiled faintly. "Maybe the same part of me that broke her knows how to build her better." Mills laughed under his breath. "You sound like a philosopher." "No," Mac said softly, eyes still on the spoon. "Just a listener." The storm outside thickened. Rain hammering the roof in waves. Lightning flashed through the skylight, casting quicksilver across the bomber's skin. In that brief illumination, the spoon shimmered, not as an object of improvisation, but as the beginning of something else. The hangar lights flickered again, and Mac's gaze followed the play of shadows across the floor. In every sound, the drip of rain, the hum of electricity, the faint creak of steel, he began to hear a kind of order. A code written in rhythm. He didn't have the words for it yet, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty: the answer to surviving this war wouldn't come from command or textbooks. It would come from men who listened to what others ignored. He looked once more at the spoon, ordinary, simple, reshaped by necessity, and whispered, "There's more to you than you let on." The thunder rolled again, softer this time. The air inside the hangar felt charged, alive, waiting. And as Mac stood in that dim light, his fingers tracing the memory etched into metal, the first spark of something greater stirred within him. Not invention yet, not brilliance. Just the quiet realization that genius often began where failure refused to end. The storm outside was dying, but in his mind, a different kind of storm had just begun. The storm raged through the night, wind rattling the hangar doors like a restless beast. Inside, Mac sat hunched at his workbench, his face half lit by the dim glow of a single bulb, swinging gently overhead. The rain had turned steady, rhythmic, like a ticking clock counting down to something inevitable. On the table before him lay the disassembled remains of a communication relay, its wires splayed open like veins. Around it, scraps of metal, broken tools, and grease-stained notes formed a strange kind of order. Every surface spoke of long hours and stubborn determination. He hadn't gone home. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't even noticed the kettle's whistle fade into silence hours ago. All he could hear was the whisper of current in his mind, the pulse of something alive beneath the metal. Machines talk, he thought. Not in words, but in rhythm. Each vibration, each hum. Each failure was a syllable in a language only patience could translate. He leaned closer to the relay and touched a fingertip to the copper coil. Cold, silent. But in the memory of its last surge, he could almost feel what it had tried to do, where the current had wanted to go before dying. He closed his eyes and listened. The hangar around him disappeared. The wind faded. All that remained was the slow beat of his own heart and the ghostly murmur of electricity. When he opened his eyes again, he knew what to do. He reached for his toolbox, pulled out a length of thin wire, and began to thread it through the coil's skeleton. Not according to the manual, not the way he'd been taught, but the way the sound had told him. A twist here, a turn there, guided by instinct more than logic. He soldered the connection with trembling precision, the scent of burning flux filling the air. A small spark flared, blue, white, then settled into a steady glow. He watched it. Transfixed, there it was again, that pattern. The same one etched into the spoon days ago. A circular trace, faint but deliberate. A signature of energy behaving differently than it should. He leaned back, whispering to himself, "You're telling me something." The door opened behind him. Sergeant Mills stepped in, wiping rain from his coat. "You still here?" "It's near dawn again." Mac didn't answer. His eyes were on the glowing wire, the hum vibrating faintly against the bench. Mills frowned. "You're not still chasing that idea, are you? You already proved your point. The spoon worked. You saved 200 lives." Mac shook his head slowly. "No, Mills, the spoon wasn't the miracle. It was the message." "The message." Mac turned toward him, eyes sharp, alive in a way they hadn't been before. "Every failure leaves a pattern. Every overload, every short circuit, it tells you why it happened. The marks on that spoon, the way it cooled evenly instead of burning through, it means the current didn't resist the fix. It adapted to it." Mills blinked. You're saying the electricity wanted to flow that way. I'm saying it learned to, Mac said quietly. We'll keep fighting machines like enemies. But what if we could make them cooperate? Not by replacing parts, but by shaping their paths. Mills laughed softly, but there was unease in it. You sound like you're talking about living things. Maybe they are, in their own way, Mac replied. Energy isn't dead. It's just waiting for understanding. The words hung in the air like smoke. Mac turned back to his workbench and picked up the spoon brace he'd removed from Eleanor. He placed it beside the glowing relay. The two shapes, one curved metal, one copper coil, seemed to mirror each other in miniature. He smiled faintly. See this curve? It's not random. It distributes stress evenly. Just like the airflow over a wing. Nature does it all the time. We've just never listened. Mills crossed his arms. And what do you plan to do with that? Mac looked toward the hangar, where the outlines of other bombers loomed in darkness. Build something better. A failsafe. Something that doesn't rely on perfection. Only understanding. He scribbled on a scrap of paper, sketching rough arcs and lines that intersected like rivers. If we can read the patterns left by overloads, we can design circuits that know how to heal themselves, redirect power, balance it, breathe instead of burn. Mills stared at him. You're talking about a living circuit. Mac didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the glow of the wire, eyes reflecting its faint light. I'm talking about survival, he said finally. Machines that can forgive human error. Lightning flashed outside, throwing their shadows long against the hangar wall. The thunder followed, rolling deep and far away. Mills shook his head slowly. You'll drive yourself mad chasing ghosts in metal. Maybe, Mac said softly. But madness builds what reason won't. For a long moment, the two men stood in silence. The storm's rhythm softened, the rain tapering to a whisper. Mills finally sighed and turned toward the door. Get some rest, Mac. The war's not ending tonight. Mac didn't look up. His soldering iron hissed softly as he melted another joint into place. Neither am I. When Mills left, the hangar returned to its hollow quiet. The bulb above Mac flickered once, twice, then steadied again. He picked up the spoon one last time, holding it close to the relay's glow. The two lights, metallic and electric, seemed to pulse together, in rhythm, as if sharing some unspoken understanding. He whispered to the dark, You and I, we're not finished yet. Outside, the first threads of dawn began to weave through the rain clouds, thin and silver. Inside, at a lonely workbench in a forgotten corner of war, the beginnings of genius flickered to life, not loud, not proud, but quietly certain. What had started as a desperate fix, with a spoon, was evolving into something more, a way of thinking that could outlast the war itself. And as Mac sat there in the dim light, the hum of the relay filling the silence, he finally understood what the machines had been trying to say all along. They didn't want to break. They wanted to endure. April 1943. 2 weeks since the storm, and the airfield no longer slept. The wind carried the steady rhythm of preparation, the metallic groan of bomb racks being loaded, the cough of engines tested one last time, the murmur of men speaking too softly for courage, too loudly for peace. The war had reached a fevered tempo, and everyone could feel it in their bones. Mac stood in the hangar doorway, coat flapping in the cold air, a mug of untouched tea cooling in his hand. Beyond him, the squadron's bombers waited under the bruised dawn sky, silver giants lined in perfect symmetry. But symmetry meant nothing if one failed to rise. Command had ordered a high-risk night mission, deep into occupied territory, low altitude, heavy payload. Every aircraft needed to fly. Every system had to hold. There would be no room for miracles tonight, no spoons, no luck, just precision and nerve. And yet, Eleanor sat dark and motionless in her bay. Something was wrong again. The mechanic nearest the nose wiped his brow and shook his head. She's dead, Mac. No response from the main control. The new power coupler keeps tripping the circuit. Mac set down the mug and walked over, boots echoing on concrete. What happened? Power test last night. Everything stable until we hit full draw. Then she just... The man hesitated, went quiet. Mac crouched beside the panel, the smell of burnt insulation rising faintly. He removed a bolt and lifted the cover. Inside, The copper lining had darkened, as if scorched from within. The spoon brace was intact. The problem was deeper, hidden beyond what eyes could see. He exhaled slowly. She's telling us something again. The younger mechanic frowned. Telling us. She's just. Mac shot him a look that silenced the rest. Machines, he'd learned, had tempers. Not anger, not malice, just limits. Push them too hard, they bit back. He reached for his tools, his movements deliberate, unhurried. Around him, tension filled the air like static before lightning. Officers moved briskly, checking watches. Engines from other hangars roared alive one by one. The countdown had begun. 10 minutes until readiness report. A voice shouted from the flight office. Mac ignored it. He was listening to the faint hum beneath the silence. The residue of power trapped somewhere it didn't belong. He'd felt this before. Energy searching for escape. He brushed a finger along the internal fuse line and felt the tremor, a vibration too small to hear but too sharp to ignore. Somewhere inside, the current wasn't dead. It was trapped, waiting for a path. He looked at the wiring pattern, the modifications he'd made weeks ago. They'd worked under pressure, but now that same design was betraying him. His own creation was fighting back. "Pull the backup," one of the men said. "We can swap it from another bird." Mac shook his head. "No time. That'll ground both." "Then what do we do?" Mac didn't answer right away. He stared at the spoon brace, the soft curve of steel that had once saved lives. The way it had distributed heat, guided current instead of resisting it. Maybe he'd been thinking too small. "Mills!" he called out. The sergeant jogged over from the tool truck. "What have you got?" "I'm going to rewire the bus. Reroute the current around the coupling entirely." Mills frowned. "That's madness." "Mac, you'll fry the whole board. Not if I give it a new bridge." "With what? We've got nothing left." Mac's gaze shifted to the bench, bits of scrap, thin wire, fragments of copper mesh from a damaged transmitter. "I'll make something." "Make?" Mills echoed. "We're out of time." Mac didn't stop. He grabbed a strip of copper mesh, bending it into a thin arch with a pair of pliers. "You said that before," he murmured. The clock ticked louder. Command voices grew sharper. Orders echoed across the airfield, growing closer, heavier.